Well, good morning to anybody who may be listening. I'm going to have another rant this morning, I think, because there's a matter on my mind. I went to the pub on Saturday. I think it was on Saturday. It might have been Sunday. And there was a young man sitting there on the table near to me. The pub was quite empty. It was early in the morning. And he was already there. I'd arrived 3 minutes after it opened, so he was there with a purpose. And he seemed to be very agitated and troubled, and he was making sort of jerky movements with his hands and his arms, and he seemed to be a man in anguish. But I said good morning to him, and he smiled and said good morning, and I became curious, and as I sometimes do, I struck up a conversation with him, some remark about the weather. There's always some way of getting into it. And he had a story to tell me, and he was keen to tell it. And the story was that he'd been abused by his family, and he'd been through hell of abuse, and then he'd gone into psychiatric ward, and they'd given him medicines, and it was all because of the family abuse that he'd suffered. And now he was hoping to get back on his feet and start working, and how he'd got £400 was going to come to him at the end of the week, and things were going to shape up very nicely. So I chatted to him a bit more about all this stuff. I'm quite I don't know whether I'm an expert at all, but I've looked at the family abuse, the historic abuse situation quite carefully, because this was a major theme, the central theme of Stéphane Molyneux's philosophy at the time that I became involved with him. I think he might have shifted his focus now, but it was all about childhood trauma and the damage that it does, and recovering from it. Now, this young man that I spoke to told me that he'd cut off contact now with his family, and he'd done it a couple of years ago, and that was the start of his healing process, as it were. So Molyneux used to call this process defooing, and he claimed that it was really necessary for everybody to defoo. And by defoo, he meant to remove your family of origin, that's foo. And I suppose to be like the prodigal son, but not returning. And he went through this quite a bit, and it became a bit of a scandal because it got into the newspapers that he was actually recommending this practice. And he was interviewed by Joe Rogan, who put the question to him, and he lied. He said it was a minor issue, and that was really the start of my I think that's when I started to retreat from his teachings. I began to see him as a false prophet at last. But nonetheless, I learned a lot from his description of childhood trauma, and I learned a lot about myself. And I dutifully went through the defoo process, and I just stopped responding to calls from my family. My father never called, but my mother did a couple of times, and I just didn't answer. It was cruel, really, but that was the technique you had to use in order to detach yourself. I had a few issues, and I'd spoken to them, my parents, about my childhood, and they really didn't know what to say, other than that I should leave, which I did. It was all very tense. The things that I was saying were true, though. I wasn't making up stories. I was relating my experience of my childhood and the difficulties that I'd faced because of the family dynamics. And I think that period, cleared my mind. Um, I hadn't followed the Lord Jesus Christ, of course, at that time. I was still walking in darkness. But gradually, I came to see, and after 2 years, nearly 2 years, I returned to my mother and father's house and apologized profusely for my detachment, and explained that I'd been involved in what is effectively a cult, and I'd been overly influenced by it. Overly, but not perhaps entirely incorrectly, you see, because family trauma is a real thing, and I think it's important to face it. I don't think it's helpful, though, to defoo, and I was a little bit critical that this fellow had done it, but I didn't say that. But after talking to him for a while, it became clear that he was using his traumatic past as an excuse, and that was his go-to. So he didn't really have to pay any attention to what he was doing, so it seemed to me. And I explained to him as clearly as I could that our condition of mental clarity is very much dependent on how we view our life and how we view the world. And if your world view is that you're a trauma victim and recovering from abuse, then you're not going to be happy, because really the better worldview is to enjoy the sunshine and take every day with joy as it comes, and generally uplift your mind and remove it from dismal thoughts, and that would produce a state of greater tranquility and health, without denying that those things may have happened. But really, the trouble is with the childhood trauma business that it locks people in to a vicious circle where just dismal matters are going to be reinforced and you have no strength. But I believe that we are all victims of childhood abuse of one sort or another. And if you don't think you are, then maybe you should think more deeply about your childhood. I haven't met anybody who hasn't suffered childhood abuse, because our parents brought us up in ignorance. Even the religious parents, or perhaps even particularly the religious parents in some cases, forcing some wicked Masonic doctrine on their children, and sometimes treating them harshly. I remember there was a young fellow who came to the church that I attended, the Bible-believing church, quote unquote, and he'd been brought up in a Plymouth Brethren household, the exclusive Brethren, so he was not to mix with other boys, and he had no television, and he wasn't allowed to celebrate Christmas and stuff like that. And he told me about it, and he felt quite disappointed by it. But again, it was holding him, it was binding him. This is the problem. To know something is valuable, but to be bound by it is an absolute drudgery. That's the problem. I tried to explain to this fellow as clearly as I could, and at a certain point, of course, I said, well, you do need to read this book. I had the Bible open before me at that time in the morning, and I do sometimes read a couple of pages in the pub, and I found it helpful. Sometimes people wonder, I suppose, but I'm not doing it for that reason. But I was able to show him the Bible, and I said, you need to read this. And he took that on board with grace. He was, I'm sure he might have been mentioned to him in the past, but he was clearly suffering from some kind of, what do they call, like a sort of psychological, mental illness. His movements became repetitive. He would, as soon as you can buy a drink, because in that pub on a Saturday, for some reason, alcohol isn't served before 9 o'clock in the morning. And so he was having a coffee, and he said, I'm going to get another drink. And I thought he meant another coffee, but then he explained to me carefully that coffee makes him anxious, so he can't drink very much of it. And at 9 o'clock sharp, he was at the bar, and he bought a beer, a pint, and the glass was probably empty by 9:05, and he bought another one. And I think that one disappeared down the hatch very quickly also. And then I think he bought a third. I might be adding one there, but he certainly had quite a bit of alcohol in a short space of time. It didn't seem to help him all that much. He went to one of the gaming machines as though he was going to play it, but then he didn't. And then he tried to pick up his glass, and he had to keep picking it up and putting it back down. What's it called? Like a tick. He picked it up and he lifted his wrist with his other hand as though his hand was injured. I don't know what had happened to him. And it occurred to me, looking at him, that this was possession. He was possessed. That was his problem. And I sort of said in my mind, I called upon the Lord to remove it. But in my mind, I don't think, if you followed the Bible, you could say, well, you could just go up to that person and call out the devil in the name of the Lord. But I can't. I wouldn't do that. I think it's. I just don't feel confident that I have that authority. And certainly, you would be viewed strangely by anybody who overheard, and people would overhear. I don't know whether you can even do something like that in public premises. This is exorcism. The Catholics practice it, but can we? I don't know. I suppose we will know that when the time comes, perhaps. But it seems to be very what's the word for it? Presumptuous, really. I mean, Jesus Christ did it, and the disciples did it. The apostles are they called? But I'm just I just don't feel strong enough to, and I don't know whether I just don't know whether I can do it in respect of another person also, because people are entitled also to be who they are, I suppose. I know there are religious people who will do that, but they are, as I say, religious people, generally speaking. And the person then will be bound to their organization if they do something like that. And you could say maybe that's why they're doing it. I mean, there's money in exorcism. And there's plenty of people who like to lead others. They feel they have some right or title to do so. But they don't, of course. But when at the Bible-believing church, there was a young fellow. I remember he was sort of hoping, I think, perhaps to become the minister at some point. He was a nice young man, and he was married, and his wife was very pleasant too. And I'm pleased to hear that they had a child together before I left the church. And so I was a fan of this fellow, and he used to read from the Bible to the rest of the church, but he read very poorly, to be perfectly frank. Well, only in the matter that he didn't try to read any meanings into it. He just read what was written as far as he could, and it became plain to me that he didn't really understand it, and he was the first to admit that he didn't understand it. And so he used to almost idol worship the minister, who seemed to understand everything in the Bible because he'd read it 40 times and he was clever. Those were his credentials, more or less. He hadn't been to divinity college. He was very dismissive of anybody who had a PhD in divinity or whatever it's called. They were derided, scorned. DD, Doctor of Divinity, Divinity Dog, I think he used to call them, or perhaps a worse word for the first D. I can't remember. Desperate dogs. Oh. But this young man, I don't whether he adored him or not, but he wasn't critical. He'd been brought up in a family with a drunken father, and he was beaten, he explained. And he was very, very, I think he was still in contact with his family. He hadn't followed any other, any kind of childhood trauma investigation. But the trauma was driving his life, really, because it was unacknowledged, or it was unresolved. It was acknowledged but unresolved. And I remember I mentioned to him something about psychology, and he said very quickly that all that stuff was just unbiblical, and he had nothing to do with it. It was every time he hears the word psychology, he hears something that's against the Lord. And I don't really agree with that attitude at all. I think that's a dangerous assumption. And I don't think it's true in that case, you see, because if you have suffered from a difficulty as a man with your father, you haven't felt loved, you haven't been appreciated in one way or another, and it's very common, then there is a risk that you will attach to father figures and give them undue authority over your life. And I did this with Stefan Molyneux for a while. And so I studied it and I began to understand the mechanism. And of course, I came to the cross. So I no longer longed for my absent father. Although he was alive, my father was alive at the time, but he didn't love me, and the matter irked me because I thought he should. And really, I'm right. A father really should love his child. There is an obligation to do it, I think. It's not vice versa, though. Children love their parents based on different criteria, really, or based on what they do and who they are, I suppose, and their childhood experience of them. My daughter was brought up in a family at war, and I was so sorry and ashamed, but I couldn't seem to do anything about it. I only stopped fighting with my wife, really, when I learned more clearly what kind of relationship I had with her and why I was looking inappropriately for something that wasn't there. And that, I don't know. I was helped by the witch with that, actually. So it's recent. But you know, it's important to investigate childhood trauma, and the best way to do it is, I might have said it before, is to find some photographs of yourself as a child and just start trying to empathize with them and remember your pain, because we all had pain, and then we shut it out of our mind, so the pain then controls the way that we live our lives because it's unacknowledged, you see. But once you acknowledge it, it eases, and it'll never be absent. It's part of your life, you see, but you're freed from that bondage by doing that. God bless this morning anybody who may be listening. I've still got leaks in the roof, so I've got some work up ahead once it stops raining. God bless.